a Virginia courtroom in the mid-1700s, a woman named Mary Aggie stood before a judge, not to defend herself with a lawyer, but with lineage. She traced her ancestry back to a free woman, arguing that her own enslavement was unlawful. Her case rested not on testimony or character, but on genealogy. In early America, family history could mean the difference between bondage and freedom. But Mary Aggie was not alone. Across the colonies, people used family trees to claim land, assert status, and protect privilege. Genealogy wasn't just a record of who begat whom, it was a form of power. It shaped who belonged, who ruled, and who was remembered. In her book, Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America, historian Karin Wulf uncovers how family history was used to build nations, enforce hierarchies, and sometimes challenge those same hierarchies. Today, we talk with her about how the past was organized through kinship and why understanding those structures still matters in the present. Welcome to Reunion, a podcast about how family history helps us understand the past and why it still matters today. This series is sponsored by the Center for Family History and Genealogy and the Family History Program at Brigham Young University, which offers the world's only undergraduate degree in family history and genealogy. I'm Joey Stewart, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Christopher Jones. We're both assistant professors of history and faculty in BYU's Family History Program. Studying history helps us to see what matters most to people in the past and how those values shape the world we live in now. Family history is more than names and dates. It's a way to explore memory, emotion, power, and connection. It gives historians a flexible method for understanding everything from slavery and migration to religious conversion and cultural memory. This is Reunion. We're glad you're here.
Karin Wulf is a historian of gender, family, and politics in early America, and the author of multiple books, including most recently, Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America. She is the 8th director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library and professor of history at Brown University. She previously taught at the College of William & Mary for more than 15 years, and from 2013 to 2021 directed the Alejandro Institute of Early American History and Culture. She also taught at American University and Old Dominion University following her receiving her PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. Her work explores how early Americans used family history to make sense of their world. We're delighted to welcome you onto the podcast, Karin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled with the whole structure and concept of this podcast. So it's just great to be in conversation with you.
Your book, Lineage, explores genealogy as both a personal and institutional force in early America. What first drew you to this topic?
Well, I think like lots of historians, the first thing that happens is you encounter something in the archives that you don't understand and you want to explain it to yourself. And that's what happened to me. I think a very typical second dimension there is that I encountered something that I didn't understand because I was sort of enthralled to a kind of caricatured framework that I needed to discard before I could really do this work. I was working in Pennsylvania archives. Some of my early work and actually work I'm returning to now involves women writers in 18th century Philadelphia and the Delaware Valley. And I was working in the Quaker collections, and I kept running across these examples of Quaker families exchanging information about one another. Send me information about when Aunt so-and-so married Uncle so-and-so, or remind me of the date when great-grandma died. Just little family record scraps. And I thought, this looks exactly like the genealogists who are sitting next to me at the Historical Society. What is happening here? And I also thought, what is happening here? Because don't these people know that this is the late 18th century? It's the revolutionary moment, man. It's supposed to be all about individualism, and we're about nuclear families now. And we've discarded this whole idea that the family is the source of your status and position. What are they doing? So I started to pull the thread of the archival materials and then figured out relatively quickly that this was not just a Quaker practice, and that the things I thought about how people understood family in the late 18th century were quite wrong-headed, and I needed to unlearn them in order to unpack this archival quandary.
Quakers are vital to all historical questions, especially in the 18th century.
Yes, Quakers are always a great way into historical questions.
I'm thinking about how families make institutions calls back to something you say in your introduction, that genealogy functioned as a form of statecraft. So how did family society function as a tool of governance, law, and or religion in colonial society?
That's the biggest question of the book. And it's why I use that kind of big word statecraft in the introduction. I'm hoping we'll have a chance to talk a lot more about this, but the idea of genealogy as a hobby or as something that's only of private interest, of interest to individuals and their family connections, is one that we sort of learned over the 19th and 20th century, and that may be exacerbated by entertainment or media representations of what genealogy means. Certainly for me personally, I'm not a genealogist. I learned a lot from genealogists. I have enormous respect for the discipline, the practice, and for the deep meaning of genealogical work. But I watched a great aunt many decades ago fill binders full of plastic sleeves of photocopied information and thought this is her hobby, that it wasn't about more than a hobby. And I am totally guilty of that kind of dismissive attitude towards it. But genealogy sits so firmly at the foundation of so many early modern and then modern and in fact contemporary structures of society and governance, including religious institutions. And Quakers are a great way for us to understand that in the 18th century that I'm looking at, but also in their 17th century foundations. So a key thing that occurred to me as I was working on these Quakers in the 18th century and their fantastic records was, first of all, wow, the records are amazing. Quakers keep all these records of their families, and anyone who works in this early period is so beholden to how great it is. In fact, in the 19th century, when the British Public Record Office begins, they're, hey, you know what? We should stock this with those Quaker records first, because these people have records. The reason Quakers had those is that in the 17th century, when they were a dissenting sect and they were highly vulnerable to legal procedure, they knew that keeping close records of their family was essential. They knew that keeping vital statistics about births, marriages, and deaths, all of those key things, was important for protecting individuals, protecting their relationship with one another, and, for example, protecting children's ability to inherit property from their parents. Because if their parents' marriages weren't seen as legitimate, weren't performed in the Church of England, where Quakers were begun and rooted in the United Kingdom, then children could lose their property rights, or married people could not have their marriages recognized. So there is this infrastructural political reason for Quakers to keep family records, and they're a great example of a phenomenon that's much larger than Quakers.
You alluded to an understanding of genealogy as a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, as a much more modern sort of hobby. It seems that that understanding has helped obscure the reality that genealogical consciousness and genealogical practice, genealogical awareness was everywhere in 18th century British North America. We've talked a little bit about how states, how local governments, how imperial governments had an active interest in genealogy for a variety of reasons, but you also uncovered a variety of ways in which otherwise obscure individuals across the social spectrum recorded and used family history. Was there anything that surprised you about the ways that you saw ordinary people across race, class, and gender identities utilizing family history and genealogical information?
Part of the potency of the book and the problem of the project is that, for me, once you begin to see the depth and breadth of genealogical work in early America, you can't unsee it. It is everywhere. It is in economic records, it's in court records, it's in private records, it's in religious institutional records. It is just everywhere, because family connection was not just a private matter. It was a matter of public interest, deep public interest. It was a matter of law. It was a matter of economic structure, and it was a matter of state formation too. So where isn't it? And this is a really important question. But to go to your question about ordinary people using genealogy, there are two dimensions to that. One is the way that people proactively asserted their genealogical information or their lineage information. And Joe, you mentioned this at the beginning in the introduction about Mary Aggie and other kinds of people who showed up in court to say, look, my lineal connections demonstrate that I am a free person and I should be a free person. That's an active assertion. There's the other way in which people's genealogical information was extracted from them and then used sometimes for and often against them. And I would say, just to stick with her example or others like her, people were being enslaved also because of assumptions about extracted information about their family relationships. Slavery is, I think, the apex example of the state instrumentalizing genealogy. But there are so many. In New England, of course, we know in the 18th century, there's a broad system, a so-called warning out, that people who were born in a particular town could not travel to another town if they were poor, and it was assumed that they would become a burden on the public purse. So people were warned out, literally, we are warning you to go away, leave this place, and return to your place of origin. That's a genealogical infrastructure. That's an assumption about, we know you're not from here, and you are not from here because you were not born here. And we know where you were born because we have records. So there is this idea too, and this goes along with the assumption that genealogy is about this later period, that there are no records and that people at the time aren't resting on records. And of course they are. They're gathering all kinds of data about family relationships. So were there moments that surprised me? Yes. Assuming we can talk about George Washington at some point here, because there's a definite mic drop moment for me with George Washington in this research.
It's 2026. I absolutely want to hear about George Washington, Karin. Before you do so, though, your observation that once you identify genealogical records or genealogical practices or genealogical consciousness, you start seeing it absolutely everywhere. And you saw it in these 18th and early 19th century records. Joey and I often talk about, we're both trained as historians and not as genealogists who now teach and train genealogists in BYU's family history program. And we talk about this often, how it wasn't until we sort of made that slight transition, that slight turn in our careers, that we started seeing genealogy absolutely everywhere in our own respective fields of study. I'm an early American historian. Joey's a historian of 20th century religion and race. And we both talk about, oh my gosh, this is everywhere. And we were somehow previously unaware of that, or at least not conscious of it. But as soon as we started teaching this, as soon as we started thinking about this is absolutely everywhere across at least the breadth of American history. And my guess is much more broadly than that as well. So I really do get what you're saying there. That said, I really would love to have you share with listeners this moment you had with George Washington on his, or at least implicating others on his plantation at Mount Vernon.
I'm going to take the privilege of reading a quote that has been important to me. This is from Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of George Washington, Washington, A Life, which he published in 2010. And it begins on the very first page. This is literally the first sentence of this biography. The crowded career of George Washington afforded him little leisure to indulge his vanity or gratify his curiosity by conducting genealogical research into his family. Literally the first sentence. And I think that's such an important, not just because, it won a Pulitzer and because Chernow inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton or anything else, but because it's such a revealing sentence. In that sentence, Chernow says, basically, that genealogy is about leisure, vanity, and merely curiosity. And that is the kind of caricature of genealogy that I think we work against when we want to see genealogy really as infrastructural. It so summarizes for me why it is that even someone who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about George Washington couldn't understand that genealogy sits at the root of Washington's status, wealth, and position. So what happened is that I'd been researching for many decades. This book took a long time to produce. And I worked in lots of different kinds of archives and lots of different kinds of places and in lots of different kinds of approaches, because while genealogical material is often thick in archives, it's not always categorized in a way that you can access it. It's better now, but I knew from the Library of Congress records of the papers of George Washington, these amazing volumes, these red, enormous elephant folio size, bound in red leather volumes of George Washington's papers. I knew there was a little family tree that George Washington had drawn. So I went to the Library of Congress to see it, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to get in and actually see them, because they'll say, well, it was microfilmed a zillion years ago, and then we digitized the microfilm. You can just look at that. I had to plead my case. May I please? So I did get to go. And there's more about Washington and genealogy in the 1790s later when he's president. There's actually stuff on Washington and genealogy throughout his life. So I went in to see this particular volume and I opened it up. And first of all, I knew it was Washington's handwriting because by that point, happily, some of the documentary editors of the Washington papers had been helping me understand the transition in Washington's hand, literally his handwriting from the time he was a young man, where, he's a writer guy, he's a surveyor, he's writing lots of stuff, to later when he's president and he's got this very loopy, later stylized handwriting. So I knew it was Washington's right away. And it's a remarkable little family tree drawing that has 6 generations of Washingtons in it. I knew that it had been misdated because it was dated in the 1750s, but I knew it was earlier than that because it includes some of his nieces, but not others, the children of his brother, Lawrence. And I also noticed how detailed it was. Washington himself was born in 1732. He listed on this little family tree, which just looks like a rough sketch, but it's not. It's quite careful work from a young man who was a surveyor at this time. He included his father's first child by his first wife, a little boy named Butler, who was both born and died in 1716. So that from George Washington, who was born in 1732 and wrote this thing in the late 1740s when he himself was a teenager, tells you what level of detail George Washington knew about his own family. That was important. And then I turned the page over and I was standing up so I couldn't fall out of my chair. But if I'd been on a chair, I would have fallen out of my chair. Because what wasn't cataloged in the Library of Congress, and by the way, this object never appeared in any of the documentary editions of the multiples, including the very excellent, most recent editions of Washington's papers, never appeared because documentary editors probably thought, who cares about that? Not important, right? But when I turned it over, it had a list of tithables, which means enslaved people on whom the Washingtons paid a tax. Tithable lists in Virginia are actually quite rare for various reasons of recreation and preservation. There aren't that many left. So just the fact of a tithable list being there are other ways that enslaved people are documented on plantation records and so on. But this tax list thing, that's relatively rare. But it listed people who George Washington clearly inherited from his father and his brother, Lawrence. And all the people who are on this list are on their estate inventories, so I could document them. So this one piece of paper shows you that for George Washington, on one side, this very detailed family history, right down to little Butler, born and died 16 years before George Washington was born. And on the other side, the people who were enslaved by the Washingtons. It's the source of George Washington's wealth inherited and his status on one side, and it is the cruelest cut of genealogy on the other side, that people are themselves inherited by the Washingtons and are inherited the status of slavery.
Something that you mentioned, and this is something we'll link in the show notes, is something that you wrote for the Smithsonian magazine about George Washington in this document. You write, family was both a matter of emotional connection and of business. Men of Washington's status kept records as keepsakes, but also as indicators for legal matters like inheritance and which property, either in the form of land or human labor, was transferred. Some of the most regularly consulted legal works for lawyers, judges, or other officials reproduced examples of family trees to illustrate the importance of knowing and recording such information. So what I see in this partial paragraph is you doing the work of not just seeing what Washington is doing as a genealogist, as a legal mind, documenting how and where he received his property. You mentioned that you're working in inventories, that you're working in other legal documents. What sort of research process do you go through to be able to squeeze out more detail and be able to make broader historical arguments from those very small pieces of information from little Butler to those that he enslaved? And I hope that we have a moment to talk about in his will, those that he chooses to grant freedom to versus the folks who were still enslaved by Martha Washington.
This whole project feels, and maybe this is true of all historical work, it's almost impossible to live in the middle register, that you're working both at the 30,000 foot bird's eye view and the very worm's eye view at the very, very, very micro detail. So it is like little Butler, and it is also William Blackstone. When I was talking about that kind of legal framework, I'm talking about some of the most consequential and continuing to be consequential legal theorists of the 18th century. William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England were enormously influential to the founding generation. And they continue to be cited by the Supreme Court today. But this is another, not exactly of quite the same level of fall off my chair thing, but I did not know. And I feel like other people who work on Blackstone or who even invoke Blackstone had not really contented with the fact that a significant portion of Blackstone's commentaries are about genealogy because it's about property.
This is something that I hammer with my students over and over again. The law is about relationships, one person to another, whose property is whose, who is doing the right things, who's doing the wrong things, and what happens, good or bad, to those involved in the law. So understanding as Justice Blackstone is working, but just thinking about how legal theory is all about our relationships one to another in society, and with family as the basic unit that most people are going to operate in, both at a personal and at a legal level.
100%. And I think a thing that people miss about Blackstone often is how explicitly genealogical those volumes are. You can find Blackstone's work in just about everybody's library or their accessible library collections. And Blackstone has these beautiful family tree illustrations of the family of John Stiles, who he uses as his exemplar of how do you understand your relationship to your cousins and your third nephew, or a child who is born actually out of wedlock, or how do you understand all these relationships? And Blackstone is so detailed about that. And when Americans adapt Blackstone, even when American legal theorists like the very important Virginia jurist St. George Tucker adapt Blackstone, they do not discard that. They retain that because it's crucially important. So it felt like working both at the 30,000 foot level of let's let Blackstone stand in for the legal framework of property is about the ability to convey that property through inheritance as much as it is about selling it through contracts. And then also at the very micro level of understanding George Washington's relationship to his long dead baby half brother. So I don't know that there's a method to that exactly, except continually trying to understand the biggest possible implications of the way that these details were important at the time. George Washington knew, he probably didn't say to himself, I include Butler here because I understand a Blackstonian concept of the common law. But at some level, that's entirely the operating system.
Yeah, and just a natural connection between George Washington and The Wire, all the pieces matter.
One of the great things about your book that listeners might be interested in is that it includes a number of really fantastic images, including some that we've mentioned here. But I was really struck while reading by the variety of sources that you encountered, some textual, some visual, some material. What kinds of sources were most revealing in your research, or was there an example of one that really grabbed you as you were researching this book?
So there's so many amazing objects that I got to work with. I'm not a material culture scholar, so I think my work with objects, and particularly inherited objects that carry, for example, family emblems at the very elite level, some of these gorgeous silverware that has coat of arms, heraldic devices of various kinds, and then at the very ordinary level of objects that were passed on, even textiles or so on. I don't know that my work is particularly stunning in that regard, except that I'm able to stack it up. I'm really dependent on people who work with that material really deftly, like Laurel Ulrich, for example, who's obviously completely amazing. And his work's really shaped my own in so many ways. This sounds quite dull, but one of the things that was important to me is the textual evidence of the no longer extant material objects. Being able to read in wills and estate inventories the description of something that we don't have access to anymore. Occasionally, I would read about something and then actually find out that it did survive, and that was amazing. But really, it's the kind of ordinariness of the things that people really invested with meaning and wanted to pass on, but that we can only see the barest shadows of now. And then again, I'm a text person, just the materiality of how people wrote these small family records, the way they leaned into the ink and the way you can see their handwriting change, and maybe over interpreting on my part, but brief genealogy is a real thing. It's a real thing in the 18th century. It's a real thing now. And the way that people recorded family material in the context of loss was, it seemed to me, materially evident.
One of the things as historians we love is when people leave stuff in the archives, as you mentioned, the material culture and what matters to people. It can be something really valuable, like say a silver cup, but it could also be something that has more emotional value, something that is everyday use that doesn't necessarily have a monetary value in the way that we could recognize gold or silver. Did you find any of those examples in the archive? And if so, how did they shape your thinking about the everyday lives of these early Americans and British colonists?
The thing that makes me, anyway, always sit up is hair, locks of hair when you come across them. Archivists and librarians are really attentive to the care with which they treat these biological objects. But sometimes you don't know that it's there because you haven't unpacked the thing. In fact, just right here at the JCB, just about a month ago, I was working in something and opened it up, and we had no idea there was a lock of hair there. It actually is related to a founding family. And that's always stunning because, first of all, hair does not lose its luster even after centuries. So it looks like it was just cut yesterday. And people didn't wash their hair. What? Their hair is very shiny and it retains a lot of tensile strength, especially of young people. So children's hair and young women who die in childbirth, these are the ones that I've come across most often. And those are really very, very moving. In fact, I start the book with a volume of family history associated with the very most elite family in all of Anglo-America. And that little book includes multiple examples of hair stitched into that volume. So hair, to me, is always the one that seems most immediate. And of course, no one could know then what we could do with DNA, but it's startling now to think about what kind of information actually has traveled over the centuries.
The very first academic conference that I ever attended in 2007, I listened to a paper on hair art in Mormon archives, and it was simultaneously repulsive to me and just utterly fascinating. And so I've been interested in that sort of ever since, not in my own research, but just in any time anything about hair preservation or locks of hair or hair art of any sort, it really does grab me. That presentation that I heard in 2007 at the Mormon History Association meeting was by my colleague and friend, Jenny Reeder, a really fantastic historian of material culture. Karin, let me ask you a more practical question. A lot of our listeners are educators and teachers and professors. How do you teach students to think critically about lineage? You see it everywhere in the work that you do, but how do you get others to do that same thing? And not just lineage as ancestry, but really as a historical method, as a way of sort of illuminating previously overlooked parts of the past.
That's such a great question. I'm always writing a bunch of things at once, and I have been noodling with a piece right now which asks this question about how we take family history and better integrate it into the biggest stories of all. I think family history is very compelling to people. People like to write it. We see more and more kind of popular histories of family. We see more and more, for example, histories of individuals who were enslaved and write the history of their family coming out of slavery, or enslaving families writing about their relationship to understanding that history. But we still don't have a fantastic way of history writ large thinking about family. And I think that's not just true because of the Ron Chernow piece that I quoted, but we think about the big topics in history, economics, politics, war. We rarely put family there. It remains a so-called soft subject. But we know that's not true. We know that family is emotional and deep and so potent and powerful and joyful if we're very lucky. But it is also structural, and it structures politics, and it structures economics, and it in fact structures war. It structures all of those things. So I think the challenge is to give students a sense of that, again, that relationship between the 30,000 foot level and the worm's eye view. I think many colleagues and friends, and certainly I've done this in the many decades that I've taught family history, love to have students do a little bit of family history themselves. And sometimes that's a pretty fraught thing because sometimes they learn things that they didn't know or didn't want to know. Or sometimes it's not a deep enough experience, and it's really hard to hold that tension between deep enough and not too deep in a way, and keep it appropriate in an educational setting. But it is equally important to make those connections to the bigger stories. So yes, you can embed an individual family's history in the history of whatever, so many different things. But how does understanding the family actually help us not just plug into those bigger stories, but change those bigger stories? How is it that family is actually the bigger story? I used to teach some work when I taught a graduate seminar at William and Mary on history of family, stuff about early modern colonialism and the way that family and structures of family and ruling families, whether in particular kinds of imperial moments or in particular kinds of new structures like the Dutch Republic, that families themselves were making this happen. They weren't a consequence of, they were the drivers. And I think that's the model that I want to reach for always.
One of the ways that I see this is not just in George Washington, but in Martha Washington and her family. Something that I teach in my classes on genealogy and families in America is actually George Washington's will, where often students are surprised that George Washington does not free all of the people that he and Martha Washington enslaved together, but rather those for which he had legal ownership over. Martha Washington chooses to continue to enslave dozens of people on Mount Vernon. I'm wondering if you could speak to the way that law and gender and power are working here in a way that family relationships are not as straightforward as man owns everything and can make all decisions related to family or kinship, but that women too are making choices and have the ability to affect not just their own lives, but other people's lives.
Yeah, it's so important to understand that you can have a clear hierarchical structure, like that men had enormous power over women in this world, and that the law ensured that, but also that the law had facets to it, which gave women leverage in particular places. And that family and family law is the root of that. In this case, we're talking about coverture and we're talking about dower portions. So coverture is the law that says that when women marry, men then essentially take over their property and manage it all. And some categories of their property, most categories of their property, men gain ownership over, but some categories they simply gain management authority over. And when men die, the requirement is that they make a provision to their surviving spouse for a certain percentage of their property. That's called the dower portion. So Martha Washington comes into that marriage with George. I mean, he marries like every other man in his family did. He marries someone quite wealthy. Doesn't mean anything about how they felt about one another to say that this was absolutely a wise strategic marriage. But she comes into that marriage with a great deal of property from her first marriage. She was married and had 2 children, and her husband died. And much of that property is in enslaved people. So George Washington actually can't free those people. So the question is, could she have? Yes. I've actually had the great privilege of writing about Martha Washington recently for a project called In Pursuit. And that essay will launch on President's Day in 2026. President George Bush is writing about George Washington, and I have written about Martha Washington. I know, it's the pairing I always knew was coming, right? You can see it, you can link to In Pursuit on the show notes. But anyway, so I've read a lot of Martha Washington's work. The folks, the documentary editors, the papers, the Washington papers have produced a fantastic volume of her work that helped me a lot, as well as reading other kinds of folks who have interpreted Martha Washington to try to understand her a little bit. She's a fascinating and complex character. She is not the banal granny figure that she often looks like when she's rendered as a salt shaker, for example, in 1950s Americana. She's a snappy woman. She's a snappy dresser, but she's a snappy woman. She's canny, and she does not seem to feel any kind of compunction about slavery. We know that from Erica Dunbar's fantastic work on Ona Judge, an enslaved woman who ran from freedom when the Washingtons were trying to hold her in Philadelphia against actually the law there, that Martha Washington was very angry about that. George Washington pursued Ona Judge aggressively, but Martha was angry. She maybe didn't encourage her husband's better angels in this context. She's a person of agency, she's a person of property, and she exercised both. It doesn't mean she's without any redeeming features. That's not true. She innovated the role of First Lady. That was a complex thing to do. She made some real contributions there. But like her husband, she's a very complex figure.
To wrap up here, Karin, let me shift gears just a little bit. Is there a book that has recently ignited your historical imagination?
Always. First of all, I love to read. It's just an extraordinary thing to be able to pick up a book and read. And I guess there are 2. One is super nerdy. So let's just get that out of the way. The other is also nerdy, but slightly less so. One is that very early in my career, I edited the commonplace book of an 18th century woman writer, Milka Martha Moore. And in her lifetime, she compiled this book called Miscellanies Moral and Instructive. And decades ago, when I was writing about her, I completely ignored that. I thought, what a dull little volume. It was a volume that went through many editions. It got blurbed by Benjamin Franklin, but I really ignored it. And recently I've come back to it and started a micro project on it, and I'm enjoying it. And she's full of hilariously unattributed aphorisms. So I'm really enjoying that. The second is that this summer, for the first time, I read Moby Dick. And I was supposed to have read it in high school, but I didn't. I was doing other things instead. And I had avoided it for a long time. I'm kind of hostile to the 19th century because it messes up everything we know about the 18th century. A lot of caricaturing of the 18th century gets in the way. It's also a very boy book. So I had avoided it. But I live in New England now, and we're surrounded by this beautiful watery place. And I wanted to understand this. And right down the street from me, there's a fantastic Melvillian space, Providence Athenaeum. So I just thought I should read it. And it was great. Like, it was such a weird book. It's so weird. I did not know how weird it would be. I am a person who likes texts. I'm a person who likes people who commonplace. And I did not know that Moby Dick begins as a commonplace book on everything to know about whales. I thought it was Call Me Ishmael. No, it's the Sub-Librarian. It was a revelation, and it was so fun. And I took a ton of notes, and I read like 5 other books around it. And it was a summer adventure. I just loved it. It was so much fun. And I'm reading a couple of other whale books, novels that were written around the same time about Nantucket, including a great one about Miriam Coffin.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thanks for stopping by and speaking with us on Reunion, Karin.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on Reunion. Family history isn't just about names and dates, it's about relationships and how those relationships have shaped laws, power, and the structures that govern our everyday lives. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really helps others find the show. We'll be back soon with more discussions about why family history matters, because family history is history.